So I want to just turn to you, Mike, and just ask you, one, there was some scare that you went missing. I know that I've heard you on George Galloway's show and some other places talking about it and how you are fine, and that's great. You are here. But you have actually been traveling to the front lines of the Donbas region for quite some time, doing a lot of work there, sending aid to the people. Could you talk about your work, what got you into that, and how does it relate to this conflict? Because you've been covering this conflict for quite some time and are really one of the leading, I think, voices from the West. Now, I believe you live in Russia, correct? And
Correct.
doing a lot of work to expose the truth of the situation. So I just want to turn to you first and allow you to talk about your work.
Sure. So for those of people watching that aren't quite familiar with some of the backstory to how I got into this, so yeah, I currently live in Moscow in Russia. I've lived in Russia since 2018. I actually held off for a little while about covering the special military operation. I had a YouTube channel that was previously gaming based, so I didn't want to do gaming, despite that being the industry I was in. I thought it felt quite dirty, talking about this alternate universe with something going on that was such seismic, actually, certainly in the geopolitical field. For about a month or so, I was on WhatsApp, with friends back in the West, and kind of chuckling at the very conflicting news that was going on. So they'd send me an article, and I'd say, "Oh, that's interesting. That what you're seeing, here's what I'm seeing." And we'd kind of chuckle about the discrepancies between the two. But then it got to the point where I lost track of the lies. And I'm not going to say who was lying. I'm just saying I just lost track of the changing narrative between the two sides. So I thought, actually, I'm going to have to document this. So I carried on in the same format that I was doing with the sort of gaming updates and things, and I did it with the news. And I think of 10,000 subscribers roughly that I had on that old channel at the time, I think I lost 100 and then gained 100,000 within about 6 months. There was clearly a hunger and a need and a market for this. Very quickly, RT was banned in some of these, not all the Western countries, but many of them. And eventually that's what got me pretty much banned now, because NewsGuard picked up on the fact that I was restreaming Putin's speeches, Lavrov, Zakharova, live with translation, but most specifically because I reposted RT documentaries. I'm very open about that. It was very clear I didn't have the means to produce these documentaries, but there was clearly an appetite for this information and for people to try and decide for themselves. NewsGuard, being a front company for the US State Department, I have no doubt whatsoever, has successfully lobbied YouTube and now has seen me with a second consecutive ban, third overall, where I'm unable to post, which exacerbated the situation you just touched on when I lost contact with my colleague John Mark Dugan back in Moscow. And that only came about. I visited the front lines near Solidar, which is quite close to Bakhmut. And John lost touch with me, and our plans changed due to being out of communication because of the Ukrainian practice of targeting foreign SIM cards. So, of course, I had to turn my phone pretty much completely off and leave it that way for fear of exposing any position or inviting any artillery on our position where we were. So that coincided with having said that I'd be back at the hotel that evening, and then not, and having to hunker down in a basement near Solidar, Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, as it's now known, therefore resulted. Unfortunately, John went public. I've already reamed him out about it, and Masha has as well. He went very public very quickly. You usually give at least 24 hours, and you send out the search parties first. But I was in good hands. Of course, I was in some level of danger. I can't say I was never in any danger. Being that close, of course, you're at some risk. But I was in good hands with good people, and they took good care of me. So everything was okay, thank goodness.
Great. I just had a microphone snafu.
I did
I
see
hope
that.
I hope I'm back. Oh yeah. Well, I'm glad you are safe. Give me a quick sound check, everybody. But
You're all good.
good.
My end.
Okay. So, with that said, yes, great that you're okay. Interesting that Ukraine is targeting foreign SIM cards to then shell. Could you comment on that? I mean, that's maybe
Yeah,
both of you
sure.
can comment on that. Yeah.
I've pretty much said the advice that I was given by the frontline soldiers at the time, that they're scanning using these technologies to identify, and I have a Russian SIM card, so I would be a prime target. Marsha had a local one that wouldn't be quite as at risk, but still, you can't take any chances, especially when and this is, Brian will understand from his military background as well, it's not about yourself, it's about those around you, so you don't want to put anyone else at risk. But Brian, feel free to weigh in.
Oh no, that it makes perfect sense. I think both sides are looking for this type of signal to home in on under certain circumstances. I think we're all well aware that Ukraine is much more liberal on where it targets, and they have a habit of deliberately targeting civilian areas. And if they, I could easily see them rationalizing, well, it's probably civilians, but they've got a Russian SIM card, so let's just send off a few rounds, see what we can get.
Sure. Some people have also commented about foreign SIM cards. Well, yes, due to the infrastructure, yes, these regions are recognized by Russia as Russian territory. But I think the only Russian telephone provider is MTS that has got itself set up in these regions. So when you're on a network that is Russian owned, that is not currently operating in these regions, then yes, it's easy to say foreign SIM card, whereas yes, I appreciate it is Russian territory according to Russian law. So I just clarify that point to the eagle-eyed in the comments.
Right. Well, maybe we can now pivot to this attack on Moscow. You are there, Mike, in Russia, and I'm wondering what the reactions are to this, and maybe we can talk about where this fits in. Vladimir Putin's calling it a war crime. It was targeting this drones were targeting a residential building. And while I don't think there are any dead, and I think Russia's air defenses actually were quite effective, this seems like it's happening more and more. There was an earlier attack on the Russian government, on the Kremlin, in early May. And of course, there have been terrorist attacks inside of Russian territory, numerous, targeting journalists and others who perhaps are saying the wrong thing about the Ukraine conflict. So maybe we can turn to you, Brian, first about what's your reaction to this and where you see this fitting in this larger setting of the conflict.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear from Mike about how on the ground, how the Russian population is reacting to this. But this fits into the pattern that Ukraine has exhibited for many months now. They're unable to make anything happen on the battlefield strategically, so they focus on these highly visible political acts that are, as has been said by Russian commanders, these are irrelevant strategically, tactically, psychologically. I would almost bet that Russian people see this and react in a way that is more supportive of Moscow than the other way around. It's only going to make things harder for Ukraine. It will give Moscow more political capital. I think, the attack on the Kremlin, I think when the Russian people see Ukraine shelling the Donbas region, using HIMARS on Donetsk city, I think it just compounds their problem. I don't think it's doing anything to help them. And again, this is because they cannot make anything happen on the battlefield strategically.
Just to back up what Brian said, news today about shelling in the Belgorod region of Shebekino, in that area of Russia. The West is crowing about the fact that there's an incursion in Russian borders and there's an evacuation. Well, yes, Russia is taking the commensurate measures to protect its population by evacuating them out of there, because Ukraine is shelling civilian structures, as it has done for the past 9 years in Donbas. It's now doing it directly to Russian Federation territory, as recognized by international law, I will stipulate. This is typical behavior of Ukraine for the reasons that Brian's just said, because they can't make any effectual or effective actions on the battlefield. Today, even the Ukrainian commander has admitted that around Bakhmut/Artyomovsk, that any advance there has slowed to a halt. There's no further progress that they can make. James cleverly claiming that, oh, Ukraine is completely justified to extend its power beyond its borders and hit Russia. And he said in self-defense against military targets. Well, but we've not seen that against military targets. Cleverly, not so cleverly as I prefer to call him. I mean, it talks a load. And then we've got Jean-Corinne Pierre, who says the opposite. We don't support any strikes outside of Ukraine's territory, which, I mean, she's got the hairstyle of a clown, and you can paint her up pretty easy to look like a clown. But yeah, sounded very clownish when she said that, given that it is definitely Western, if not US-based equipment that is facilitating this. The reaction, as Brian's just said correctly, is a solidification, further cohesion of Russian public sentiment, and all it does is just serve to prove Putin right. Both, not just now, I'm talking about over the years since the Munich conference, where he gave that speech there that not led up to this, but was prior to all this, where he said about NATO's actions, certainly in the West, and Medvedev. A lot of other people have picked up on what I did as well, where his latest tweet, or the tweet regarding this, a comment by James Cleverly, where he said, England, our eternal enemy. I mean, that's a huge shift there. I'm not just saying from Medvedev. Medvedev has gone from being quite sympathetic to the West, as everyone acknowledges and knows, to now very hawkish and quite bellicose, actually, in his language recently. But to state that as well as our eternal enemy, I wouldn't say that Russians are that far. And he has been picked up. I've read it in Russian media. He has been picked up on that phrase. It then said that London is quite concerned by that rhetoric. So I guess good job, Medvedev, on that regard. It hasn't worked to date to make London worried about anything. Look at this attack on the Black Fleet. Those, I believe, were British drones. These boats that were sent against the Black Sea Fleet. And great hullabaloo said, oh, we've attacked the Russian fleet. And then it rocks up, I believe, in St. Petersburg not long later. Fully fine, no problems to it, despite all the claim in the West. And yet the Russians also had footage of destroying these drones with, they called it, conventional artillery armaments of these naval forces. So I really don't know where Ukraine got that idea from. Add all that, if we want to touch on the Western propaganda, I've literally got an article up in the Daily Mail where it's talking about how a Russian missile nearly hit a motorist. And what they don't do is show the freeze frame of the missile, because the freeze frame of the missile shows it's a Patriot missile that comes down on the highway. But hey, it's Russian, whatever. And even in the comments, some of the first comments there are like, yeah, guys, even Kiev admitted that was a misfired Patriot missile. Just like kind of ease it down a little bit. But yeah, overall, these attacks on Moscow, ineffectual. US media, I shared on Telegram today, showed a collapsed building that they said was a result of the drone attacks on Moscow. Turns out that building was in Iowa, and it happened a few days ago.
Wow. I mean, when you have Daily Mail readers just debunking the Daily Mail, things are bad. Yeah, because I know you're aware of the Daily Mail's reputation, and
if it's in the Daily Mail, it must be true. Was the sardonic kind of catchphrase that we had for the Daily Mail back in England. Yeah.
I mean, the propaganda is absolutely it's so stark and it's so in our face. But then there's this, like, what does this get Ukraine? And most of us understand, who watch this program and who will follow your work, Ukraine doesn't do anything without the United States' salute. So what? If it's not effective, what is this doing for Ukraine to do these ineffectual strikes on Russia, like now deep into Russian territory, not just the territories that have recently been integrated?
Is that directed at me?
Oh, Brian, or you can go first.
I'll let Brian go.
Okay. Well, I think it's for lack of any better options. What else can Ukraine do at this point? And as Mike was pointing out, the propaganda is becoming ridiculous. And when you lie about everything all the time, even your own lies start to contradict each other. So I saw some tally of, Iskanders. They claim however many Iskanders Russia has left, and they said like they fired 5, but the other day they claimed that they shot down 6 in one day. I mean, it's just because it's so ridiculous, so many lies, they can't even keep track of all of them. And anyone paying even slight attention to what's going on can see this. And I think even people who are supportive of Ukraine have to, in the back of their mind, realize that they're obviously lying. They cannot keep their story straight. What does that mean for the overall effort for Ukraine? How is this going to turn out? Why are they lying? If everything is going as well as they said that it was, why do they tell such ridiculous and such numerous lies? And I think the obvious answer is things are not going that well for Ukraine. I think we can see that.
I'll add, actually, I shared an article with another YouTube channel, a very big one, in fact, whereby, I want to get my facts straight, like with who actually reported it, because this was one of those common things that actually Brian has pointed out in some of his videos. It wasn't just the fact that American US 84 weapon systems, which were originally shipped to Ukraine, have been purchased by Cartel Golfo in Mexico. It wasn't just that. There was a Russian bombardment of Ukraine's capital kills at least 3 people. In that same article in NBC News, it, and I quote, says, Ukrainian air defenses shot down all 10 cruise and ballistic missiles launched by the Kremlin's forces, but falling debris caused damage and casualties on the ground, wounding 16 people, according to the authorities. So, sorry, but how does the headline match up to that? So, Russia killed at least 3 people, but Ukraine shot them all down and it only wounded 16. Now, unless 3 of the 16 went on to sadly pass away from their wounds, I don't know. But, like, even the same article, you have the headline, and then you actually read the content, and suddenly it doesn't quite add up there. And so you have one side who's relying on these tactics. As I've said, there's one case I've got links for where it's been called out with this channel using actually footage from another side of the world, alleged to be Moscow. And then you actually have the very, far slower than many people would expect, even Russians, progress, the very steady progress of the Russian forces. Particularly now we've just seen the fall of Bakhmut, which is, again, has been a slow, methodical process. It's not, people often criticize Russia, or they're losing the information war. Does that really matter when you've got the results on the ground? I then saw a CNN report about, forcibly shipping Ukrainians to Russia. Turns out it's not true. And then when CNN actually interviewed the refugees who'd come to Russia, they said, don't talk to me about Ukraine. We're seen as collaborators and we're already criminals because we've had to pass through Russia to get there, and actually we're going to stay. So one side that's relying on this, and then, again, as I've reported, Ursula von der Leyen, for the first time, actually, I could agree with her when she said she didn't support a ceasefire. So if we think that if Russia were to now slowly and methodically reach all the borders of these integrated territories following the referenda, what would happen then? And actually, I do agree with von der Leyen that no, NATO wouldn't tolerate a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities along these borders, because I believe NATO would antagonize. NATO would carry on destabilizing that area, or at least keeping this conflict going however which way they can. Not necessarily even if Ukraine is defeated, but if Russia achieves just the objectives, and I'm just limiting it, I'm not talking even about Odessa at this point, which many people believe is one of the objectives. But at this point, let's just stick to those areas that have voted to be part of the Russian Federation, and the Russian Federation believes is part of it. Then no, that's the one time I've been able to agree with the head of the EU there. Brian, feel free to comment.
Well, you were talking about the AT-4 anti-tank rocket. That's
great
actually
accounting, Pentagon.
there's the most recent aid package. What is it dated? May 31st, 2023. They have more AT-4s because I guess they saw them in Mexico and they're like, well, I guess we'll just have to send them more so Ukrainians can use them. I mean, and it's, people predicted that this would happen. They said it's just a matter of time before we see these weapons somewhere else where they don't belong, because there's no accountability. Ukraine was notoriously corrupt even before this started. The people in charge are out of control, and there were all of these issues that even the West had to admit were taking place, and now we're seeing it. So there's AT-4 rockets, anti-tank rockets, in the hands of drug gangs in Mexico, and then you'll see the Americans and the U.S. government saying, "Oh, we need to do something about Mexico." It's been the U.S. destabilizing Mexico all along. This is just the most recent example illustrating this.
Again, apologies for laughing, but yeah, that's my dog. Humor
I mean,
kicking
it's
in
so
there.
absurd. You either laugh or cry.